Nothing but war prepares you for war itself. My name is Diane Carlson Evans, and I'm grateful for this interview. I am always happy to talk about my brother and sister veterans whom I served with honorably during the Vietnam era. The Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular because the American public were seeing, for the very first time ever in the history of the United States, they were seeing the war on television. They were seeing it upfront and personal. They were seeing the 6 o'clock news, let's say, with men on the battlefield in body bags. They were seeing napalm and white phosphorus being dropped out of airplanes. And all war movies, you see the planes dropping bombs, of course. But now Vietnam, because the correspondents, the photojournalists, and because of television, they were filming villages being bombed and children and civilian women, Vietnamese civilians of all ages who were innocent, but their villages were being bombed with the thought that those villages were empty. It was not intentional for our pilots and the strategy to just bomb innocent people, but it was what they called later maybe collateral damage. It's what happens in wartime. But the people back home are now seeing this on television, and they're beginning to believe that the war in Vietnam is wrong and that we shouldn't be there, and they want the troops to come home. And a lot of the men who are being drafted are saying, hell no, we won't go. And some of them are going to Canada to avoid the draft. But in keeping with that thought, what I want to explain for me personally is that as nurses, we knew that we were going to save lives. And I didn't know if the war was right or wrong. I hadn't studied enough about Vietnam to really even know, except that it's across the Pacific Ocean and that it was near China. But I knew very little about the war, whether it was right, whether it was wrong, whether to believe the president and the administration. All I knew was that I wanted to be a nurse and that my job would be to save lives. My mother was a nurse. She was the single most influential person in my life. And I talk a lot about her when I wrote my story in Healing Wounds, the book, because she influenced me every day. Even though she was raising us 6 kids on a farm, she went to work at the hospital, and she told me, Diane, she said, I love my work. And I said, well, why can't you just stay home with us? And of course, when you're a child, you want your mom to stay home with you and not go to work. And Mom said, but I love my work. And of course, when she was home, we were her sole attention. She was a wonderful nurse. She was a wonderful mother. So I had a tremendous influence in just seeing all the good that she did for our community and for that small hospital in Minnesota. So I was drawn to nursing, and then I was drawn to Vietnam because of that 6 o'clock news that I just spoke about, in that people are seeing what's happening to our soldiers, and they're also seeing soldiers on stretchers, on gurneys, being taken by helicopter. So now what I'm seeing, the images that I'm seeing on television are helicopters. It was our first helicopter war because we had them. And helicopters were being used for air ambulances. And you would see the medevac, we call them dust-off. Dust-off was, when I called helicopters dust-off helicopters, people say, well, what is that? What's a dust-off? And of course, to me, it was just like part of our language. It was a code. dust off needed. It was a medical air ambulance. It was a Huey, and those pilots were amazing. They were young like us, even younger, and they would fly into the worst possible conditions and being shot at even, and in terrible weather, monsoons and wind and mountainous regions and jungle and rice paddies and all the kind of terrain that you can think of, the topography and the difference between the southern part of Vietnam near the Mekong and the Delta compared to the jungle the further north you got. The war changed in temperature and terrain, and these pilots were fearless. I'm sure they were afraid. I can't say they were fearless, but they had to have extreme fear, but it didn't matter to them. If a dust-off was needed to get out the wounded, they went in and they sacrificed their own lives by the thousands to save the wounded. And so us nurses, with these dust-off pilots, we were the team. They brought them to us, and the doctors and those incredible medics and corpsmen. Corpsman and medic is an interchangeable word. I called them my medics, I called them my corpsmen. And we were the team. And at the end of the day, we were all they had. I came from Minnesota, from a farm family. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a dairy farmer. There were 6 of us on the farm, and on a dairy farm, it's all about hard work. And my 2 older brothers, then me, then 2 younger brothers and sister, all had our jobs to do on the farm, and there was a serious work ethic. So in the 60s, when my 2 older brothers had to go into the Army, it was hard on my dad because he lost his helpers, but he was very proud to have his sons serving in the military because, of course, he came from the World War II generation, and it was honorable to serve your country. However, our nation at the time was not supporting the war, so there were protests, and my dad was concerned about how the nation was really feeling about the farm boys around us who were getting drafted. When I, as a student nurse in Minneapolis, decided that if my brothers and all my neighboring farm boys have to go to Vietnam and they're being wounded and dying, they must need nurses. I mean, every war has always needed nurses. So I found a nurse recruiter downtown Minneapolis, and I walked in and I asked some questions, and I said to this Army nurse who was in uniform, I said, I'm in nursing school, I graduate in 1967, and I want to go to Vietnam. And they must be taking nurses. And she said, yes, we are in dire need of nurses. There is a shortage in the Army Nurse Corps. And she said, what year are you? And I said, I'm a junior. And she said, well, the good news is there's a program where the government will pay for your tuition, your books, your uniforms, and give you a stipend if you sign on the dotted line to join the Army Nurse Corps. So I signed on the dotted line. And because I just knew, did not hesitate for a moment. I was going to be an Army nurse, and I wanted to go to Vietnam and take care of those young men, those young boys like my brothers. So I had decided that with my brothers both now in the Army, and I had visited my oldest brother at Fort Lee, Virginia, so I had a little closeness to the Army and felt that as an Army nurse, perhaps I'd be in the field and I'd be taking care of those young men who were also serving, who were drafted. But I felt like I never really thought about the Navy or the Air Force. I just wanted to be an Army nurse. My aunt had served in the Army during World War II. I was very proud of her. And after she got out of, when the war ended, she used the GI Bill and she went on to get her doctorate degree and became a college professor. So I had just decided that the Army Nurse Corps was for me. And so I signed on the dotted line, the necessary thing to do for me as a student nurse to promise the Army that I would serve 2 years if I signed up as a junior in college and they would pay my tuition and my books and my uniforms and a stipend. And I didn't dream that was even available, but it was great to have some help to finish my schooling because I was working jobs to help pay to get me through school. But now I have to go home and tell my parents what I have done because I hadn't mentioned this to them at all. I had not talked to them about the fact that I was even thinking about going into the Army. So the next weekend, I waited till my dad had finished milking his 40 cows. And the night that my mom was home, she was a nurse and worked at the hospital on the 3 to 11 shift. And on the evening that she was not working and Dad was up from the barn, they were in the kitchen and we sat down and I just said, Mom and Dad, I want you to know that I signed up for the Army Nurse Corps and they couldn't promise me, but they said it's very likely that if I want to go to Vietnam and I volunteer that I will go. After I graduate from nursing school and pass my state boards and go to basic training, which would be 6 weeks at Brooke Army Medical Center. The kitchen got very quiet. And my dad, who was a stoic Scandinavian Swede, who was not very talkative, didn't say a word, but he slammed his fist on the kitchen table and walked out the door. That was his response to what I had just done. He was not happy at all. My mother, who was a registered nurse, was quiet, but I think she understood. So I've had my 9 months of working at Fort Lee, Virginia, Kenner Army Hospital, before I left for Vietnam. It was interesting because when I volunteered to go to Vietnam right out of basic training, the officer said, well, it might be a good idea for you to get a little experience before you go off to war. And I thought, well, I can't agree more with that, to go off to war when you're 21, almost 22, without having had a lot of experience. So it was good experience. My soldiers, my patients at Brooke Army Medical Center, it was an orthopedic unit, and there were about 40 returning GIs. GI stands for government issue. It's an old term, and government issue is our draftees, of course, but these young patients, all of them had been wounded in Vietnam and had orthopedic injuries. And they were young, and I was young, and it was an interesting 9 months because these guys, they knew that I wanted to go to Vietnam, so they pulled some tricks on me that were pretty funny. And but some of the experiences I had in that unit weren't funny because I didn't understand what soldiers were like when they came home from war. I'll give an example. One night, I'm on night shift, and I'm passing out medications and starting IVs and doing all the things nurses do. But I hadn't learned that you never startle a returning soldier. So he was sound asleep, and time for his meds, and I went up to him and I got close to his face and I shook his shoulder, and he wouldn't wake up. I shook it really hard, and all of a sudden, he woke up and he tried to put his hands around my neck, and he just almost came out of his traction. Now, this is an orthopedic unit. They're in traction. Their legs, their arms are in traction. And he swore at me, and he said something, and don't you ever do that again. I could have killed you. And I was like, it was his startled response. It was like he thought I was the enemy. Like, he was terrified. And so then I learned that you go up to their feet, you at the end of the bed, and you wiggle their. I said, well, next time I'm just going to wiggle your foot to wake you up. And he said, well, that's fine. That's fine. And then another night, I dropped a bedpan. Now, a metal bedpan on a tile floor makes a whole lot of noise, and it woke up. Every guy in that unit woke up and started swearing at me. And so I wasn't making a very good impression my first couple of weeks with those guys. But they taught me a lot. My orders came, and I was to leave July 30th, 1968. And I flew home to say goodbye to my parents on my way to Vietnam. And it was a hot summer, sultry Minnesota humid day, and it did look like it might start raining, and my dad had to get in the alfalfa. That's what farmers do. They look at the weather, and everything depends on the weather, what their plans are. So he was not taking me to the airport. My sister and my mother were taking me, but I went down to the barn to say goodbye, and Dad came out in his Sears Roebuck overalls, and that he was always in. And I said, well, Dad, I'm just going to say goodbye. And my dad was not very demonstrative with affection, but he hugged me, and he had tears rolling down his eyes, and he said, I have 4 sons, and I send my daughter off to war. And I never forgot those words, because when you're 21, which is what I was, you don't think about being a parent. You don't think about what is it like to send a son or daughter off to war. You just think you're sort of bulletproof, and you're just thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about what your parents think about it so much. And then after I had 3 sons of my own, years later, and a daughter, I thought about, what would that be like if I had to send one of my children off to war? So it took me a while to understand how he felt. And of course, fathers didn't think very much about sending their daughters off to war. The stereotype, if you will, is that only men go off to war. But that's not true. Women have been serving our nation since the birth of this nation. They may not have been eligible for the military itself, but they served in other ways, and always as nurses. There were always women at the time who stepped up to take care of wounded soldiers. And of course, now we have men in the Army Nurse Corps. So when we talk about Army nurses, we include, of course, it's men and women serving in the Army Nurse Corps. So then now I'm off to Oakland Air Base in California to get on that airplane. And I'm in a terminal. My world is now men. I am surrounded by hundreds, soon to be thousands, of men, and soon to be my patients. And on that airplane, there was one nurse sitting with me and 2 other nurses in a different place on the plane. So it was about 247 soldiers on their way to Vietnam, and I'm sure they were all terrified. And when we arrived in Vietnam, it was late at night, and the plane came down, and it was a very rough landing because the tarmac was like a metal tarmac, and there were big holes in it from it had been rocketed and mortared, and it was kind of dark, but when we landed, the pilot said, women nurses out first. And so we went to the door, and the door opened, and there was just this blast. It's now August 1st, and there was this blast of heat and a stench, a smell that kind of smelled like the barn. I grew up on a farm, so I was used to smells that weren't, the smell of stench. And that's what it smelled like. And jet fuel, and then the sounds. But what struck me instantly was the reality that now I'm in a war zone, because the soldier who met us at the door had a bandolier of ammunition and his weapon was ready. And he said, ladies, we were called ladies. That was the last time I was ever called a lady in Vietnam. Ladies, keep your heads down and get to the bus. So we got off to this bus that was waiting for all of us, and we got in the bus, and the windows were painted black and had chicken wire to prevent any kind of shrapnel or anything if we had been, attacked. So that was a reality check. It's like, okay, now we're in the war zone. So we get to our billets where we're going to spend the night. 2 days there, getting our uniforms, getting fit for boots. They didn't have combat boots my size. Are you surprised? They issued us men's underwear. They were issuing us wool long johns that had been used in Korea. And as us nurses were going through the packets from supply of all the stuff that we were to wear in Vietnam, we started laughing. What else could we do? Like, this stuff says Korea on it. And I sent it all home to my brothers in Minnesota, and they wore it in the winter. But then we finally got issued our jungle fatigues and boots that fit, and now I'm off to my first assignment. Sometimes it's easier not to ask the questions why, but to just do your job. I've left on that helicopter from Long Binh, Vietnam, to my first station assignment, which was the 36th Evacuation Hospital in the South China Sea. Now, when I got my orders, the first thing you do, of course, is you get your orders. They tell you where you're going to be assigned. There were 27 hospitals in Vietnam when I was there. And there were aid stations, and where the troops often would go to an aid station on the battleground, on the field, close by, and they would transfer him to an evacuation hospital or a surgical hospital or the closest hospital given the nature of his wounds. So the 36th Evacuation Hospital was a typical evacuation hospital, which is 400 beds. Now, an evacuation hospital in a war zone is designed in such a way that the patients come in and they are triaged. And what triage means in a war zone is triage is different than in maybe a hospital here stateside. In a war zone, let's paint a picture. The helicopter comes in, let's say there are 8 patients, 8 wounded soldiers, 8 casualties in that helicopter. Let's say 2 of them have passed away, and they will go to graves registration, and graves registration will do its job to identify, and then the next step for those bodies to come home in a flag-draped casket. Say another patient on that helicopter has lost both legs, a battlefield amputation. The legs are gone from the battlefield, but he's still alive. And let's say the next patient has lost an arm, one limb. And of course, he has not gone into shock because the medics have done their battlefield work. They've done cut downs, they've put in IVs, they've done the tourniquets, they do all the things field corpsmen and medics do to save that life so that it can get on the helicopter and get into the emergency room, and triage will take place. say the next guy has a bullet wound, a through and through, but it doesn't appear that it hit an organ because his vital signs are still. So you've got this picture. So they're all in the emergency room now. Well, triage is done by the nurses and the doctors, and they make an assessment, and they say, well, this guy has a wound that it's just going to take a half an hour in the operating room. So they take the least wounded first because they are salvageable and they will require the least resources that we have. Say we have limited resources, whether it's supplies or physicians and nurses. So we save those who are the most salvageable. The person who has both of his legs amputated, he may take 8 hours in the operating room, or 10 or more. And he would take all the resources of those physicians while all the other patients would be waiting and possibly near death. So triage is done to maximize the resources and save those that we can, but no patient was ever left alone. So the person who has the amputated limbs perhaps is going into shock and perhaps comatose and may not have long to live. And so there will be a nurse or a medic who stays with that patient and is with them, and so they do not die alone. But that's triage. Now, I did not work in the emergency room, so where did I work? Well, I was assigned, my military occupational specialty was surgical nursing, so that I was not in the operating room. That's another specialty. My job in my unit at this 400-bed evacuation hospital was to treat the soldiers on a ward who were wounded and who were coming back from surgery or about to go into surgery. So we prepared them for surgery, or we took care of them after surgery, or both. My unit was 66 beds, and when I walked into that Quonset-style hospital, Quonset huts are individual huts that would maximize about 66 beds, and every bed was full. And it was hot. It was probably about 105, 108 degrees, and there was no air conditioning. The air conditioning was in the operating room and in the intensive care unit. So there were fans blowing, and I walked into this unit, and it is overwhelming. And this is like, welcome to Vietnam. You are now in a war zone. This wasn't my nice, clean unit at Fort Lee, Virginia. And these wounds are fresh. They have just come from the battlefield. Or they have come from other hospitals to come to our unit because we may have more space and more resources to take care of these patients. So I am now there for about 5 months when I'm assigned to the burn unit. And it's Christmas Eve, 1968, and a village on Christmas Eve was bombed, napalm, and unfortunately there were children and people in this area. It was a church, and 55 burned children came into the burn unit within a few hours. So I was assigned there, and I worked there for about a month. And that's when I came to realize the horrors of war, that it's not just our soldiers who suffer and die, but it's thousands of the local civilians. And why the children? And it was hard. It was hard to see kids suffer and die due to our military intervention. So now I'm too beginning to question the war. Why are we here? What are we accomplishing? We, as soldiers, we ask questions. As soldiers, we do our job. It's our mission. And we do our nursing, or if you're an infantry officer, no matter what your job is, and what you have a job to do, and you have a mission, and you pull together and you do your job. And sometimes it's easier not to ask the questions why, but to just do your job. But then years later, you start to question. So after about a month on the burn unit, I knew that I could ask for a transfer I had heard that once you were in some place for 6 months, you could go to the chief nurse and ask for a transfer. So I was in closer to the Delta, South Vietnam. You look at the map. It's wetter. It's the rice paddies. It's a little different kind of injuries and wounds that came to us from this area because there were a lot of tropical diseases, and there were water buffalo in those rice paddies, and they would gore and attack our soldiers. There were sea snakes that the soldiers would come for R&R and swim in the South China Sea and get bit by a sea snake. And all of a sudden now I'm not just taking care of injuries from weaponry, but tropical diseases, malaria, and the other injuries that happen that aren't from the crossfires of war. So I went to the chief nurse and I said, I want to go north. And she said, why would you want to go north? That's where the fighting is, closer to the fighting. And I said, well, I'm ready. I said, I think I have the skills, and I want to go where there's heavy fighting. And she said, well, I'll send you to Pleiku. And I had mentioned Pleiku. And I said, I know that it's close to the Cambodian border, and the 4th Infantry Division there is getting hit hard, and they're short of nurses there. And she said, yes, they are, and that's where I'll send you. Be careful what you ask for. I got on a helicopter and flew to Quy Nhon, spent the night in a nursing billets, and that was a long helicopter ride. That's all I can remember, from Quy Nhon over the jungle. So now I'm not in the rice paddies, I'm in the jungle of Vietnam. There's tigers and there's elephants in that jungle. And it's a different temperature, it's cooler, which was much better. But when I got to Pleiku, everything was orange and red. And I did not know anything about Agent Orange. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know they were defoliating the forests to make it easier for our soldiers to get through the forest, because they're using these big machetes out in the jungle, and they're just cutting down the weeds to get to where they need to go. And so we had this program of dumping a chemical with dioxin in it called Agent Orange. And so when I got to Pleiku, and the air base and the hospital base there, everything was dead. Well, it had been defoliated. So, but the 71st Evacuation Hospital was also a 400-bed evacuation hospital, and it was full. And we were taking heavy mass casualties frequently, but we were also under attack quite frequently. And once you're in a war zone, it doesn't take long to just get used to it. You get used to the sounds of the overhead helicopters coming in, and you hear the artillery hill off in this direction, and you hear the sounds of outgoing, huge, loud artillery weapons, but they're going out. But if there's incoming, you learn to attune yourself to the sounds. Your senses become very acute in a war zone. You know how close that sound is. You know if it's a rocket or mortar coming in, and there's going to be a thud real soon, and then there is, and then the next thing is shrapnel flying all over the place. That was Pleiku. It was very different from where I had just come from. And we were only a few kilometers from the Cambodian border. And the 4th Infantry Division was assigned there, and our patients were coming from Cambodia. Well, at the time, our president and the United States government now is lying to the American people about the number of casualties, about the war itself, and how the winning and the losing of it was based on body count. So troops had to count the number of bodies that were killed. How many of those dead bodies are the enemy, and how many of those dead bodies are American soldiers? And then there'd be these body counts that were sent back to the United States via the journalists and the press. And our president was saying that we are not in Cambodia. We, meaning the United States military, is not in Cambodia. Well, now my patients, not all of them, but many of them are coming into our hospitals, into my surgical unit, and I asked them where they were injured, and they would say, Cambodia, ma'am. So I did something in defiance, because, we did hear about the news. In Vietnam, we were hearing the news of the increasing protests, protesting the war, and the lies that the government was telling. And now they were lying about that we weren't. And I said, we are in Cambodia. Why aren't they telling the truth? Why are they lying to the American people? So on every single patient's record, if he said he was injured in Cambodia, I wrote on the record, injured in Cambodia, injured in Cambodia. And our commanding officer had told us that we were not to mention anywhere in any reporting that these troops were injured in Cambodia. And I thought, well, they can lie, but they can't force me to lie. And now I think my sense of the war is starting to change, and I want to know why my patients are suffering and dying. And I want to know why these Vietnamese innocent women, many of the women and children, were dying. And I wasn't getting any answers. But what you do when you're in the military, you do your job. And my job was to take care of those patients. And we took care of injured children and injured in the crossfires of war. So I'm going to take you back to Vietnam with you for a few minutes, and I'm going to share with you an experience of just one night in Vietnam. And I think this will help you understand what that whole year was like. And that is, I have several patients on ventilators. They have chest wounds. We call them sucking chest wounds. And when you have a chest wound, then the physicians insert chest tubes, and so that you can help with the breathing of the lungs and the ventilator and the tracheostomies that they had. And so they were connected to a ventilator with a trach, and they couldn't talk, and they were restless, and they were agitated. And of course, because they couldn't communicate with you, and they had high anxiety. The other patients in my unit had been severely injured and wounded, and in this particular unit there were 44 beds. So I am in my hooch, that's what we called where we lived, and I heard the air raid siren go on. When the air raid siren goes on, the red alert, that means incoming. And that means either run to the bunker or roll under your bed. That was our protection, our bed. So roll under the bed, get your helmet, get your flak jacket. But for me, it was my unit, and then I heard the incoming, and then I heard the helicopters coming, a gaggle of helicopters. When I say gaggle, what I mean is like a gaggle of geese. There's a lot of them. So now the choppers are coming in consistently, and then a Chinook helicopter, which is really loud. I knew it wasn't a Huey, it was a Chinook, and I thought, this is bad. What does that mean? It means there's a lot of wounded in that Chinook helicopter. So I ran to my ward, and now I've got my helmet on, I'm wearing my flak jacket, and I'm ready to go to work. And all hell breaks loose. And several of our wards have been hit by rockets, and I've got all my patients now under their beds. So what does a patient do? When he's hooked up to a ventilator and has a tracheostomy, he can't get under his bed. So the patients who could get under the bed, you didn't have to tell them. They knew what was happening. They were under the bed, and we grabbed their mattress and threw it on top of the patients who couldn't get under their beds. This was all the protection that we had. Now, I want you to think about this. We are women doing this. We're taking care of the men. We're protecting them. And so the myth and the stereotype has been like, oh, women can't go into the war zone or be in a combat zone because all the men will be taking care of the women, and the men won't get their jobs done because they'll be taking care of these poor wilting violets women who need the men to take care of. No, that wasn't happening. Army nurses do their job, and we were the ones that went under the bed last. And there was only one other lieutenant with me, and then we had 4 medics. And our job was to protect those patients and take care of ourselves last. And after we had them all, and then they're pulling out their IVs and they're pulling out their bloodlines, right? Because they're getting under the bed, and then their IVs come crashing down. So I was checking bloodlines, making sure that the blood was still connected, IVs were connected. And after I'd made the assessment that my patients were all as safe as, there was no safety, even in a hospital bed. So, but the little girl who had been burned by napalm and had a circumferential burn around her whole body, and her village had been burned, her parents had disappeared, the medics brought her into our hospital. She was all by herself, and she was in a crib. And this little girl was so terrified because of the sounds, because it reminded her, I'm sure, of when her village was napalmed. She was screaming. And she screamed, and she didn't stop screaming. So now think about this. We're hearing all these helicopters overhead. We're hearing the rockets and mortars and the thuds and shrapnel flying around. And now we hear this little girl screaming. So when I describe Vietnam, I say it was a hallucination. My experience in Vietnam was so surreal. It was like I couldn't make this up. This was like a bad dream, but it was really happening. And so there wasn't anything I could do for that little girl. I couldn't put a mattress on top of her. She was burned all the way around her body. Her hands were not burned. So I took her hand and I crawled under her crib. And now I'm finally in protection under a crib. And the other lieutenant, Rosemary Burke, she's under some bed somewhere in the other end of the unit. And I just held that little girl's hand. And she screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed herself to death. She did not live. We didn't expect her to live, but what a terrible way to die. And so we get the siren, that's all clear. Our guys, our weaponry has driven the enemy back, and now it's quiet, and now we clean up. And that's just one night in Vietnam, just one. And I can tell you a lot more, but we don't have time. But it's, and I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to try. I've now been in Vietnam for a year, and the tour of duty for military personnel during the Vietnam War was 1 year. Unless you were in the Marine Corps, it was 13 months. The Marine Corps always has to have one up on the rest of us. But so the tour of duty in Vietnam was 1 year. Now you could decide to stay for another year, and many of the troops did, or some of them went back to the United States and then put themselves on orders to go back for another year by their choice. My last month in Vietnam, I was exhausted, and I wasn't feeling really well. And I knew that I was going to have to go home, and once I got home, I could decide if I wanted to come back. But my last day is a day I'll never forget, because one of my patients who was on a respirator and whom I had placed his bed close to the nurses' station, because those who were the most seriously ill, we wanted to keep an eye on them. So we would move their beds closest to our nurses' station where we could see them. And I remember keeping a close watch on this young man because he wasn't doing well. And he had grown very attached to me because I was his nurse, and the only way he could communicate with me was by writing. I gave him a pen and a piece of paper, and then he could tell me what he needed or wanted. And so I had to tell him that I was leaving and that this was my last day. And I said, I'm leaving today to go home, and my helicopter is waiting for me in about a couple of hours. And he became very agitated. And he pointed he wanted to write. So he said, please don't go, don't leave me. And it was heart-wrenching, because I think he knew or thought he was going to die, and I was leaving him. And I felt at the time like I was abandoning him. Like, just when we got good as nurses, when you're in Vietnam, when you're in a war zone for a year, you get good at what you're doing. And just when you get good at what you're doing, you leave. And then the new people come in and they start all over. And that was the nature of the Vietnam War. And the soldiers will say that as well. They became by the time the year is over, they become very good soldiers, very experienced. And then we go home. But that chopper was coming, and I was going to be on it. So I looked at him and I said, you're going to be okay. You're going to come home too. And let him know that I'd be thinking of him. But I never wrote his name down. I didn't remember any names except for a couple of soldiers I cared for in Vietnam. But now I'm on my way home, and I'm thinking about him. And then we can fast forward to the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And I had wanted to see if his name was on the wall, but I couldn't remember his name. So he was one of my patients, one of my soldiers who haunted me for years. I never forgot him. And I'm sharing this with you because I want you to know why I defended Vietnam veterans and will to my dying day. That my patients in Vietnam were just as brave and just as strong as any soldier in any war. And I know, because I saw how they suffered, I saw how they died, I saw their courage, I saw how they cared about each other on the unit. And when their platoon sergeant or their commanding officers came onto the unit to visit them, I saw how much they cared for each other. And we sacrificed for our nation. But when I came home in 1969, it didn't feel like that. Protesters met us at the airport. Protesters were calling us names. And one of the nurses was called a fascist pig. I was told that I was no better than the baby killers because I was over in Vietnam oiling the war machine. And I had to stop and think about what that person had just said to me. What did he just say? He said I was no better than the baby killers because I was over there oiling the war machine. Well, I guess what he meant was I was over there saving lives, so I was a bad person. And I knew of all the soldiers in Vietnam who were not baby killers, who actually sacrificed their lives to save other lives, children included. And yes, the collateral damage, if that's what we call it, is thousands and thousands of Vietnamese, innocent civilians died in Vietnam because of the war that our American leaders forced us into. And now the American people, rightfully so, are opposing the war. I came home opposing the war. But they were opposing us for having served. They were opposing the soldiers for having gone to Vietnam when we were, the men were either conscripted, they were either drafted, or they volunteered out of a patriotic duty that we serve our country. And we were raised to believe that was the honorable thing to do. And as good citizens, you serve your country, and when the military calls, you go. And then you expect when you come home that the citizens of this country will have supported you and say, thank you. Thank you. We disagree with the war was wrong, but we want to thank you. But that never happened. That didn't happen until the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982. And so I lived with that. I felt the shame, I felt the scorn, I felt the guilt. And because even us nurses were Even the women who served were either not acknowledged or validated for what we had done and what we had given. It was all of us. If we were a Vietnam veteran, we were in the same camp, really, set up to be denigrated that we had served our country. So most of us, I can't speak for every Vietnam veteran, but most of us, many of us, just decided not to talk about it. And we just tried to forget about it and move on. And I did that very well, I thought, for quite a while. I went to an Army Nurse Corps recruiter and I signed up again for a second time. Best thing I ever did. And I was assigned to Brooke Army Medical Center in 1970. And I was promoted to captain, and I was made head nurse in the surgical intensive care unit and loved my job. I was back taking care of Vietnam veterans. And my skills that I had learned in Vietnam were transferable to Army nursing at Brooke Army Medical Center. My skills were not validated at the civilian hospital whatsoever. And so now I was in a professional and a military setting where I belonged. And that helped me. I think it helped me out of a depression where I was not happy being back home and feeling that my country had turned our back on us. And so a good thing happened at Brooke Army Medical Center. I met my future husband. He was doing his surgical residency in the intensive care unit, and that's where we met. And almost 50 years later, Mike and I are still together. And he continued to serve for 21 more years in the Guard. And Mike and I are very proud of our military service. And as a physician, Mike was very proud of those soldiers he operated on and cared for. So for us, it's been a very satisfying lifetime that we did what we could while we were active duty military, while Mike was in the reserves, and then I went on to continue to fight to save lives, maybe the emotional wounds of war. I finally, after 50 years, have written my story, and it's in the book Healing Wounds. And in Vietnam, I healed wounds. After Vietnam, coming home, and feeling that we were all suffering from something that came to be known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, I won't say all, because I don't like to generalize. Many Vietnam veterans have suffered from PTSD, and post-traumatic stress disorder is now a recognizable wound of war. It's not physical, it's emotional, but emotional wounds also need to heal. And with the dedication in 1982 of the Wall of Names, which after all those years after Vietnam came to recognize and remember those who died, and to bring us together as veterans in a sacred place on the National Mall where we could join together to finally, for the first time ever, to grieve together. In Vietnam, we never had a funeral, we never had a wake, we never got to grieve. And we became separated after the war and went our separate ways and our separate lives. But it's so wonderful to be together again with veterans who understand each other, and we don't have to say a lot. We just know that there's this bond, and it's a very special camaraderie that we have. When I say we, I say it was mostly men. Because when men come home from war, they have the Veterans of Foreign Wars, they have the American Legion, they have their groups where they can go be together, but there really wasn't a lot of that for the women. And plus now the men are often recognized, but the women are left out. In 1983, after the dedication of the wall, I learned that there would be another dedication of a new monument to go near the Wall of Names, and it was a sculpture of 3 men. The sculpture of three men was designed to honor and recognize the men who came home and survived the war. And they are facing the wall, looking at the names on the wall. Well, when I learned that this was to take place due to the controversy of the design of Maya Lin's wall, there were Vietnam veterans who opposed it. They didn't like the design. They thought it was defeatist. It was black. They called it a color of shame. They didn't like that it was underground. They didn't like anything about it. And so they got together and demanded that something more heroic and traditional portray men as men looked in Vietnam, and that would be a sculpture that looked like men, wearing their uniforms and some of the things they carried in wartime, like a weapon, the towel around the neck on one of the men. And when I saw that picture, I thought, well, if this is important to them, if this is what they want, it's a nice sculpture, but I think they forgot the women. And I was at the dedication of that statue in 1984. So it was 2 years after the dedication of the wall. I went to that dedication of the wall, and I went to the dedication of the statue, and I came home and I said to my husband, well, if they're going to have a statue now honoring men, they have to have one to women, or people will never even know women were in Vietnam and served around the world. And my husband said, well, who's going to do that? And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to try. We need a statue of women at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And from that day on, I made a lot of phone calls. I called a sculptor in Minneapolis and asked him if he would work with me. He said he would. He designed a statue of a woman. I now have called a lot of people on the phone a lot, and I describe this in the book, Healing Wounds, about what it takes. What does it take to place a monument on the National Mall in Washington, D.C.? And it takes 10 years and a lot of hard work. There was a lot of opposition to the whole concept, the whole idea. There were people who said women didn't deserve a memorial. And I begged to disagree because I was there and I saw how hard these women worked. I knew what our contribution was. I knew the value of women's contribution to the military, and I just had a feeling those wounded soldiers might come out of the woodwork and step up and support us, and they did. And there was enormous opposition to the whole, and we went to the whole concept. And so by now I have a charity established to raise funds, a 501c3. We have an IRS number. We have a board of directors, and we have bylaws. And now we're getting organized. And we are starting to organize all over the United States. And we're finding good people to support us financially, us meaning the concept of building a memorial to honor women. So I went to the American Legion, the DAV, Vietnam Veterans of America, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I got all those organizations behind the idea. They started lobbying Congress, raising money. 10 years later, Veterans Day, 1993, we dedicated the first monument in the history of the United States honoring military women on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. There were no memorials, not one, honoring military women in our nation's capital. This was a first. So yes, I made history. Was it easy? No. And was it worth it? Yes, because we didn't quit. And we defied all the disbelievers and all the naysayers and all those who said it would never happen. Because those wounded soldiers, and not just the wounded soldiers, the men who served in Vietnam and around the world during that era, who worked with military women and respected us as a team, they supported the concept, they sent money, and they also lobbied Congress. So at the end of the day, we did this together. We pulled together and did the right thing for our country, and that was to honor and remember all those who served. And it's a beautiful monument, and it stands 300 feet behind the apex of the wall. There are 3 women and a wounded soldier. The design competition that we had took a year, but we found Glenna Goodacre from Santa Fe, New Mexico, through that competition, who submitted a drawing. And in that drawing, she had sandbags, and everything was sandbagged in Vietnam, our hooches, our hospitals. So the setting, she thought long and hard about what will the setting of the sculpture, the monument be, and sandbags. And that was perfect, because that says Vietnam. Because it was a guerrilla warfare, and we were constantly being barraged by all kinds of flak and what have you. And then that wounded soldier. When she started reading about what did women in Vietnam do, well, she recognized that most of the women in Vietnam were nurses, and not all, but they cared for wounded soldiers. So the figure that's caring for the wounded soldier is a nurse, and she faces the apex of the wall. So she is right there facing that apex, facing all those names on the wall. And then the standing woman, who's a woman of color, is looking up. Well, she read about all these helicopters flying around and bringing in the wounded, and she said, well, they must have been looking up for a helicopter or divine intervention, looking up for God. And, then some of us said, well, the helicopter was God. It was divine intervention coming to save these soldiers. And, that hand was on those helicopter pilots as on our shoulders, tapping us to do that good work. And then the kneeling woman, it's a sculpture in the round. So when you're standing facing this statue, you're facing the nurse tending to the wounded soldier, and then you see the standing woman looking for a helicopter. Then you walk around the sculpture, and there's another woman, but you don't see from the front. She's kind of a surprise. She's kneeling. She's kneeling, and she's looking down, and she's holding the soldier's helmet, which he is not wearing. He has a head injury, and he has a field dressing wrapped around his head, his eyes. But kneeling down, she's holding his helmet. And so these figures are all connected. The standing woman has her hand on the nurse's elbow. I'm here, I'm helping, what's the next thing we need to do? The kneeling woman is the woman, we felt like her at the end of the day. She portrays the futility and the sadness and the carnage of war. And she could be in prayer, or she's, like I said, we felt like her every night. We were exhausted, we were tired. And she is a part of us. And all of these figures portray the courage and the compassion, the strength of women who served in Vietnam. There is no identifying insignia. We are not officers. We are not enlisted women. We're all women, enlisted officer. There's no designated rank. And that's on purpose. That doesn't matter. We went to Vietnam to serve our country, regardless of rank or our MOS. Some of the women who went to Vietnam went as women in the Women's Army Corps. They were not nurses. The women in the Navy who were not nurses, Air Force, and to honor all the 265,000 women who served around the world during the Vietnam War. A little known fact that many women would have volunteered to serve our country during a very unpopular war when we could have stayed home. We didn't have to go to Vietnam. We didn't have to join the military. But why did we? Because women also believe that they have a responsibility to serve their country. And we certainly proved that during the Vietnam War. And as all women veterans before us, World War I, to go back to the Civil War, Korea, World War II, we, Vietnam women, we stood on their shoulders. They opened doors for us. They also proved to us that we could do it. If they could do it, if they could do what they did in Korea and World War II, then certainly we could do it. We drew strength from them. And the women serving today, Iraq, Afghanistan, they're standing on our shoulders, and we open doors for them. I personally feel very strongly that the greatest privilege I've had in my lifetime, outside of raising my 4 wonderful children, the greatest privilege I have had was caring for wounded soldiers in Vietnam. It was a privilege, and I would do it all over again. And I've written my story now to show the next generations that during troubling times, during wartime, and during upheavals, whatever they may be, today we have a pandemic, we have COVID that we are dealing with. But that if we consider each one of our neighbors, our families, and all Americans as our neighbors and people that we care about and that we need to defend like soldiers defend them in wartime, we can pull together in a mission that can save everyone's lives and make our nation stronger. We're greater united than we are divided. Vietnam veterans proved that after we came home. The Vietnam veterans pulled together, and they went to Congress, and they demanded legislation that said, you know, we're dying in great numbers of suicide. We need help. And legislation was passed for vet centers, 300 of them all across the United States. Now we have one in Helena, Montana. And they are there to help veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. We pulled together to defend our problems with Agent Orange from the poisoning, the toxic chemicals that were causing serious health effects. And Vietnam veterans pulled together and went to Congress and demanded that soldiers be treated in VA hospitals with service-connected diseases and could get benefits from those. We pulled together and built a national monument in Washington, D.C. And so I think Vietnam veterans, I'm very proud of my generation. There is greatness in every generation, and there's greatness in the Vietnam generation, undeniably. There is greatness in our generation, and there is much that the next generations can learn from us.